In this video, we look at my favorite little golden book. Only this book isn't so little. Hi everyone, John here. It's no secret, you could say it's a secret to everybody, that the Legend of Zelda series is my favorite game series. And I love books about video games. So naturally, the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia, Deluxe Edition by Dark Horse Books caught my attention. The Deluxe Edition of this book resembles the gold NES cartridge of the first Zelda game. It comes in a black slipcase that resembles the original dust cover, and to take it further, it even includes an instruction manual, so you get an idea of what to expect. Mimicking the original cart is a nice touch, and it makes it look great, even when closed and on your bookcase, or next to your games, or next to your other books that look like games. The non-deluxe version is more visibly part of the same Zelda book series as the previously released Hyrule Historia and Ardent Artifacts. Despite that, the series timeline, which was first published in Hyrule Historia, is interpreted slightly differently here, but we'll get to details like that in a second. So, what is this exactly? Well, a long-running video game series that is over 30 years old, such as Nintendo's Legend of Zelda, is bound to have built up its own lore. That is, a catalog of people, places, and things that make up the setting of all the games. While each of the 18 main games is certainly unique, there are many characters and locations and objects that reappear across the series. Even if you don't take the book's timeline to be the be-all and end-all of Zelda chronology, it is interesting to see how some creatures and items have changed, or remain the same, from game to game. Though the specific details of the timeline was covered in their earlier book, Hyrule Historia, this book, The Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia, takes more of a look at the world and its inhabitants, and indexes items and monsters, as well as looking at each game on their own. If you couldn't already guess, the first book was a history book, and this one is an encyclopedia, which should be obvious by their names. So this book has compiled pretty much all that there is to be known about the Zelda series. Well, the 18 main games at the time of the Japanese version's release, that is. So, Breath of the Wild, though briefly mentioned a few times, is really not featured here, and spin-off titles such as Link's Crossbow Training and Hyrule Warriors aren't deeply looked at. And you can just forget about the non-canonical CDI games. I'm sure Nintendo would hope everyone would. So if you want to know details of anything between The Legend of Zelda on the NES and Triforce Heroes on the 3DS, there's a good chance that it is in here. So let's walk through this book. Much like the Triforce itself, and the recurring theme of threes, the book has three main sections. Each of these is about the same size, that is, 100 pages long. The first section is of historical records. It examines the world of The Legend of Zelda through the ages. Unsurprisingly, it starts with the Zelda timeline. Since Hyrule Historia, they have moved the Game Boy game, Link's Awakening, to before the two Oracle games that Capcom developed in collaboration with Nintendo. Link's Awakening now sits right after A Link to the Past, just like the game's original releases did. The asterisk here draws our eyes down to the footnotes, where it also says, "The timeline can be interpreted in a number of ways, and may change depending on new discoveries that have come to light and on the player's imaginations." So, basically, this is just one of perhaps numerous interpretations of the order of the events in the games. In a way that's leaving it open, and kind of supports what I really think, that Nintendo just focuses on making each game its own great experience. With a few notable examples where there are definitely sequels, most games are their own story, and I honestly don't think Nintendo was ever really trying to make a grand epic chronology, at least not originally. References to other games are just that. I hypothesize why the two most recent console games, as in not handhelds and not remakes, that is, Skyward Sword for the Wii and Breath of the Wild for Wii U and Switch, were deliberately made to be clearly the beginning and the end of the timeline, because it's more epic that way, not to mention much easier than trying to fit something in the middle. That's my hypothesis. I was never a total fan of the supposed timeline myself, but with the first four games all being part of the timeline branch where Link is defeated in Ocarina of Time. How does that even make sense? Like, why would Link being defeated create a timeline branch? Because then you could have similar splinters off of any game, really. But the book still runs with this, so let's also move on. The chronology, which includes events both in and outside of the games, is broken down here. There's a lot of info here, but even this is a summary since Hyrule Historia covered this in many more pages. Then we take a look at many of the common elements in the lore of the Zelda series. We learn of the goddesses, the Triforce, the Kingdom of Hyrule, and then of course a look at the many versions of the three principal characters, Zelda, Link, and Ganondorf. It's neat to see all their incarnations next to each other, where you can compare and contrast their various looks. The Zelda games themselves have taken on many different styles, from the cartoony Wind Waker to the gritty and realistic Twilight Princess, so their characters' looks naturally fit each game stylistically, which adds to each one's distinctiveness, but they are, for the most part, still recognizable across multiple rebirths. Then we see other lands and realms, because not every Zelda game takes place in Hyrule. These include Termina from Majora's Mask and neighboring regions like Koholint, Holodrum, Labrina, and Hytopia, found in the handheld games. And there are realms that are parallel to Hyrule, such as the Twilight Realm or the Dark Realm. And inhabiting all these places are the various races, such as the Sheikah, the Gorons, the Kokiri, and so on. Interestingly, the Zoras are shown to have different evolutionary paths depending on the branch of the timeline, which might be a reason why the first 4 games by release date had hostile Zoras before they were shown to be benevolent, starting in Ocarina of Time. I may have my criticisms of the timeline, but admittedly, it does fit well with the evolution of the Zoras. After learning about the denizens of the world, we see the geography of Hyrule in particular. You've probably heard me mention that the first map on my website, vgmaps.com, is of the Light World in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. So I am familiar with that, and all these versions of Hyrule, and they are quite different from one another, which is where I think the book is really reaching when it insists that this is the same world, just evolving over time. Why would you expect some features like Lake Hylia to be in the same place, but then expect that the Lost Woods can just migrate from one side of Hyrule to the other? What I really don't get is the explanation that no one asked for, and doesn't really make sense, that the entire first Legend of Zelda game supposedly took place in this tiny segment of A Link to the Past map. It's just bizarre and forced because there's no reason for that. There is an area in the Adventure of Link clearly meant to be a miniature version of the original game's world map, but the scale seems really wrong. I would call it a deliberate homage, certainly, but I would hesitate to claim it was any more than that. Then, there is a look at animals, plants, food, and so on. Various examples of each of these from different games are seen together on these pages. Here we read sentences such as rabbits were thought to be extinct in the era of Ocarina of Time. While this is supposed to be a way of supporting the timeline by way of an explanation of a rather specific detail, I find it kind of weak, yet also forced, and so actually draws attention to a potential flaw in the timeline. So, I'm not buying that, but whatever, I guess they're too far down the rabbit hole with this timeline idea, and there's no going back now. The language section is neat because it shows how the Hylian alphabets can be directly translated to either English letters or Japanese syllables. However, the different alphabets used in different games are inconsistent with the series timeline, yet more consistent with the chronological release of the games and factoring who developed which games. So, it is another strike against the so-called timeline. While all that is interesting, and helps with the world building of the series, we finally get to some practical stuff when we get to the section on weapons and equipment. We've got swords, including, of course, the Master Sword. We've got shields, bows and bombs, and a myriad of other things that Link, or the various incarnations of him, has used, sometimes in more than one adventure. Want to know how they look in each game? It's all in here. Even rupees, the currency always seen as hexagonal crystals, still manage to have subtle differences, matching the style of the various games. There's even a chart showing the value of each of the various colors of rupees, which are actually slightly different per game. In fact, it seems like only 2 games, which are the most dissimilar looking, Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, have exactly the same values across the board. Ending off the historical records section is a look at monsters and demons. While not a detailed bestiary, that will come later, this is more of an overview of recurring families of creatures. For example, there is a brief history of the Blins, which is apparently what they now call the group that contains Moblins and Boblins. This continues with the Stals, which are the Stalfos and Stal children, and others with names beginning with Stal, and Octos, which include Octoroks and Octoballoons, etc. Now, the second major section is the database. This archive of information is more of a reference section about what Link directly encounters in-game. The first part of the database lists and describes all the towns and villages in the order that Link would visit them, in the order of the game's releases. Then the item section is probably what you would most expect from an encyclopedia about The Legend of Zelda. Listed alphabetically, we see all of the items featured in all the main games. When items reappear across different games, you can see their various incarnations together. By chance, many of the most recurring items begin with the letter B. On this page alone, you can see multiple versions of bombs, boomerangs, bows, and boss keys. But many items appear in only a single game, and even so, sometimes only briefly, like the items used in lengthy trading sequences in certain games, or the various collectibles, like in Skyward Sword and Triforce Heroes, or the critical quest rewards from beating bosses that Link stuffs in his inventory and that you immediately forget about. Any Zelda fan can name a dozen pieces of equipment that Link may have, but there's no way anyone can name every one of these. This is incredibly thorough, with 29 pages in all. Then we're back to looking at various locales, so just like the towns and villages section, the dungeon section similarly lists them in the expected order within the game, and by the game's release order. Now I know this isn't an atlas or a strategy guide, but I would have liked to have seen more of each dungeon. 1 to 3 tiny screenshots don't seem to do them justice, especially since dungeons are a huge part of most Zelda games. Though I did like that for several games, they made sure to include one screenshot of what each dungeon's entrance looks like on the outside, especially for the first game, where they are sometimes hidden. And then, just like with the items, a very expected part of this book, an alphabetical listing, but this time of the various enemies and monsters. There are many creatures, and several who reappear again and again throughout the series, but sometimes with quite a different look. Like the moblins that have changed size between games, and the wizrobes who have appeared as toucans in Wind Waker for some reason. Besides these two, it's really neat to see other classic creatures that have been around since the very beginning, and are on most entries of the series, such as the Armos, Octoroks, and Stalfos. Everyone from minor enemies up to major bosses are here. This particularly fascinating section is 53 pages long, though after reading it, I'm still not clear on the difference between Dark Link and Shadow Link, and comparing the movements of Majora's Incarnation to Ukrainian folk dancing is a weird way to describe it, since I'm pretty sure the Ukraine is not a part of the world of The Legend of Zelda. It's kind of jarring to get engrossed in this world, only to be knocked out of it by a real-world reference. The third main section is called Archives. Here, each game, again in order of release, are looked at in detailed overviews, one by one. Each features a short intro blurb about the game, like how it came about and its gameplay features, and what the developers sought to achieve with it. Then each game has a plot summary, with a collage of screenshots, then official artwork of the main characters, a character relationships chart, a description and map of the world of that game, and then development documents and/or developer notes, giving us a peek at how these grand adventures came to be. I really like this section because while it is interesting to form connections between games and map them on a timeline, or fill in other details somewhat speculatively about the history, culture, and lore of Hyrule, what is indisputable is what is in the games themselves, so it's nice to be able to focus on each one on their own. After the main games, we get brief looks at spin-off titles, such as the Game & Watch game, which I do own, plus Link's crossbow training on the Wii, and the Satellaview games that require the satellite modem peripheral for the Super Famicom. Of course, there would be a look at Link and other Zelda characters in the Super Smash Bros. Series and other crossovers, and yes, there's even a look at the games featuring the man-child Tingle, which is a rare acknowledgement of these games at all, since these games never saw a North American release. The book ends with an interview with series producer Eiji Onuma, exclusively for this edition of the book. It is translated from Japanese and was recorded on December 2016, which is why he teases the then upcoming Breath of the Wild, even though just about every Zelda fan should have already finished it by now. And if you haven't, why not? And there we have it. This is the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia from Dark Horse Books. So, it was the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia Deluxe Edition, the ultimate book about the Legend of Zelda series. By summarizing and adjusting the timeline set out by Hyrule Historia, and developing the world with detailed looks at the culture and the lives of the various inhabitants of Hyrule and surrounding areas, all with nice official artwork. Then alphabetical listings of items and enemies, and a look at towns and dungeons, all with screenshots, and then diving into each of the individual games, it certainly ranks way up there. And the icing on the cake is the deluxe version's mimicry of the original NES cartridge for fun, but also deserving of doing so. I do still have issues with the Zelda series timeline, but the book is really committed to running with it, and inconsistent details are not really any fault of the books, other than the occasional extraneous forced exposition like that line I mentioned about the rabbits thought to have been extinct. Perhaps that's just me really wanting to find fault here so I don't look like a total Zelda fanboy, but even so, I don't think there's enough here to be able to justify deducting a point or even half a point. Even when there is redundancy with Hyrule Historia, that's more of a knock against the original book than to this one here. While the first did provide more detail about the timeline, overall, if you had to pick between the two, go with the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia. So I have to give this book a 5 out of 5. I don't know if I would recommend it to every gamer necessarily, as I don't know how interesting an alphabetical listing of hundreds of items are, even to someone who may have played only 1 or 2 Zelda games. But if you really are interested in the Zelda series as a whole, then I would say, in the immortal words of the first old man in the first game, it's dangerous to go alone. Take this. except that it's not dangerous, but you should definitely take it anyway. Well, I mean, don't take this one. This one's mine. Save up your rupees, or actual currency, and buy your own. What do you think of the Legend of Zelda series? And what do you think of this book? Leave a comment below. And I've still got more video game books to review, and more videos about gaming and plain old geeky stuff. So, if you like what you see here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Okay, Zelda fans, until next time, see ya.